Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. Before I start the episode, I just wanted to let all the coaches and athletes out there know about a special deal that we've got going with Elite Performance Journals. EPJ make both coaches' notepads ideal for developing session plans and for reviewing or reflecting on sessions. And for athletes looking for that extra edge, they also have an Elite Athlete Journal designed around specific needs of up-and-coming professional athletes. For any listeners of the Coach Doctor podcast, you can receive 20% off on any of their products by simply going to eliteperformancejournal.com, check out all of their products, and when you check out, use the code CoachDoctor, all one word and lowercase, for a special 20% discount. Okay, now on to the episode. Before we start, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Ben Darwin. Ben is a former Wallabies and ACT Brumbies prop who played during a very successful era for Australian Rugby. Since retiring due to injury, Ben has gone on to coach in the Shute Shield, Super Rugby and the Japanese Top League before forging a career for himself with a company called Gainline Analytics. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Ben, after a career as a professional rugby player and then some time in professional coaching, how did you get into Gainline Analytics with your partner Simon Strawn?
I think the first sort of port of call with this was when I was playing, I was always confused about why we were successful in Australian rugby comparative to the resources we had in play. Because one of the things I knew was we weren't different as people to the people we were playing against, but the outcomes were different. So that was sort of just something that kept on popping up during my career. And there was a particular quote by Chris Martin, who was a lead singer of Coldplay. I don't know if you know very well, but he made a comment once in an interview. It's like, you know, we got so excited in England when we won the Rugby World Cup, and then I came to Australia and realised no one plays rugby. I was like, yeah, that is true. Like, how is it we're so successful with such a lack of resources? So against that context, when I retired as a player, I then started doing coaching, as you mentioned, and I was like at different clubs bouncing around. So I was at Norths, which was really tough, Western Force, which was really tough, Japan, which I don't think I lost a game in 2 years or something in competitions for 3 years. Coached at a high school in Perth, didn't lose. But I was going from place to place and really finding as a coach that I would have the same input but completely different outputs. Or I would see coaches I was working with who I knew didn't know what they were doing, but they were winning. And then other guys who I knew knew what they were doing, but they weren't winning. So I'm like, okay, that's not making sense. And then there's also this scenario, both when I played and coached, where there are teams you would play where you would look at them individually and say, we are better man for man. People talk a lot about this in English rugby. You know, I think there was a comment before the World Cup final in 2019 that every single English player was better than every single South African player they're up against. Now, that's actually true. That actually might be true, but that doesn't mean they'll win. And so I was sort of just really interested in this scenario of teams that were theoretically more than the sum of their parts, which I don't necessarily believe in as a notion anymore. It's just understanding the parts. So the last job I had was I also did data analytics and video analysis when I was at the Melbourne Rebels, and I looked a lot at KPIs, and I basically spent 6 months prior to the Rebels starting, what are the KPIs we want to use, and realistically found the correlation between KPIs and winning was pretty negligible. Basically just a way of describing how teams played. I remember one time we looked at offloads, and everyone's like, okay, well, offloads are the answer and we need to do that. And we're looking at rugby league offloads, and then we found the Lions, who were coming last, was the biggest offloading team. So it's like, okay, well, is that necessarily, the path? So, and also we look at, for example, the Crusaders at that point in 11 had, I think, the worst line out in the comp. and they were still, doing pretty well. So I found that most data analytics was not necessarily giving me a why teams were winning. They were giving me a how, but they weren't giving me an answer as to, okay, why do the Rebels suck comparative to the Crusaders, or, why are Penrith good now? Why are the Storm good now? Because if you just simply went to the way they played, you actually don't get any closer to the answers of how they've created it. And, one term I use a lot is the further you move towards correlation, the further you move away from causation, which we can talk a little bit later on about. So like I said, it wasn't really matching any of my playing experiences or my coaching experiences. I had my last job in Japan. The team went undefeated, but at the end of the season I was fired. So I'm like, well, coaching's pretty hard. Like if I'm doing the best I can and the team's winning and I'm still not keeping my job, then maybe this is not the career for me. And then I started the business in 2013, fundamentally as a database of player availability. So which players are available when and where and who, and then, what's their agents' numbers. And then clubs would come to us and say, I want to buy a player. And in doing that process and building that database, I then started to see something about the teams. And the more we did that, the more interesting the research got. So it wasn't something we were looking for. It was something we found, but it also related to an earlier project I'd done at the Rebels, which was, how long is it going to take the Rebels to win? And the answer was, well, forever if we keep doing things as we are. So the question now was, okay, what are the things we need to do to be successful? And so we're actually now, working with the Rebels on trying to find that answer and trying to help them to be successful against pretty significant limitations on their ability to do so. So the business started in 2013 as Simon had been an analyst with the Wallabies under Andrew Sullivan when he was there, the Digit, who was under Robbie Deans. Robbie Deans is now on our advisory board. And so Simon and I both done filming and ended up basically in the coach's box for the Lions series, which was a really interesting series from a cohesion perspective, particularly if you look at the third test and the Welsh dominance of that team. And literally, deciding O'Driscoll should not be in the team because of its impact on, where the understanding would impact the team. And so Simon and I have been sort of known each other since about 11, but been working together. Simon's been in the company since about 14. We've got another founder, Pat Ferguson, who's a PhD at Melbourne University, but also attended Harvard under Groisberg. Groisberg's got a lot of ideas around, portability of talent. So we kind of sourced a lot of that research and other research we found in the industry. So that's how we ended up together. It's a very long answer. I apologise.
No, that's a great answer. Just quickly, going back to your comments about coaching for 2 years in Japan and going undefeated, were you given any feedback as to why you were sacked?
So I can't talk about the complete notion of it, but Eddie Jones had been the previous coach of the club. And Eddie had brought me in at late notice because somebody else couldn't take the job. I came in, for a 2-year contract. And then Eddie had sort of moved on, and then a new coaching group had come in. And I think they decided they wanted to go with someone else. So change created more change, so to speak. But it was quite handy because the Rebels were going through significant budgetary problems at the time, and it was I did it, and I'd already lived in Japan previously, but it was one of those hundreds of situations where somebody is let go, and it may not make sense. And people have a set of ideas as to what they want to be able to do. But fundamentally, coaching, particularly when you're an assistant, you're basically powerless in your ability to make decisions around whether you are retained or not retained. And, we deal with this all the time, is you have boards who are unhappy with results based on really unsound principles, and they'll make decisions about the head coach and decide whether he should retain his job, and then the assistants are just part of that cycle. And they moved on, they're kept. And so part of why I sort of left was, man, this is a really, this is a scenario I can't control. And I think, there's a Grant I had interviewed with you yesterday was talking about, you just got to roll with the punches because you can't control those punches a lot of the time. And as a coach, what I really realized was I was giving the best input that I could, and really enjoyed the coaching process and trying to have an impact on players, both individually and collectively. But from a wider perspective, there's many more things at play that are controlling the outcomes that I couldn't control.
Can you explain in layman's terms what cohesion means in your work?
So that answer could take 7 hours, but the way we describe cohesion is we're trying to find objective measures of understanding, but not in terms of output, in terms of input. So, for example, experience playing a position is a form of cohesion. If you've driven a car for 2 years, you have a level of understanding with that car. If you've played flanker for 2 years, you have a level of understanding with flanker. When you then change to a different position, two things happen. One is you have to learn the new position. Secondly, you have to unlearn the old position. And so we talk about that almost as like antimatter is, if you look at, say, when Ireland beat New Zealand in Chicago, one of the biggest problems was Kano kept reverting back to 6, but he was playing right side lock, right? Because I think Tuipulotu had a child and there was a couple of injuries. They just could not field the team. So they're trying to make a decision there about, okay, do we go with somebody who understands the system and changes position? Do we go with somebody outside the system who is better at lock but doesn't necessarily understand? Or you can look at the Bergamasco decision where he played 9. I don't know if you remember Italy, and he was actually a 7. He's just passing as though people were standing at the top of ladders, So that's a form of cohesion. You also have interpersonal understanding. So, Little and Horan had an amazing level of understanding between each other. But in talking to, say, James Holbeck, when he played with Jason Little, he said once they came up against the All Blacks, they just had no answers. It wasn't that they individually didn't have answers, they just didn't collectively have answers. And they hadn't been together long enough to figure that out on the move. And then there's entire systems. So, for example, if you move from man-on-man defence to zone defence, that's a form of change. And then there's how many people you have in a unit. So if you look at expansion teams, for example, they'll get their set piece organised much quicker. They'll get their defence organised. They'll get their attack organised better than they'll get their defence organised. And a lot of that is because the units within those components are smaller than the whole team. So teams defend as a group, as a whole, whereas they'll generally attack as spine, or the line-out will be a unit group, and it'll be more significantly 2, 4, 5, and 6, depending on how you're going to structure your line-outs. But that will affect the level of understanding and speed of acquisition of knowledge, and then you've got the sort of simplicity of that. And then you've got things like structure. So another way is looking at what we might call singularity. So, the Sydney comp is every club is fundamentally built roughly the same way. So the Sydney Rugby Union competition, so you have first grade, second grade, third grade, then you have teams underneath. Whereas the NRL is completely different. You have first grade, and then you'll have, say, at Penrith, you might have feeders all the way down to under 16s, under 14s. Whereas, say, the Broncos have 3 feeder clubs or 4 feeder clubs straight underneath first grade, and then they have linear systems underneath them, and that is an entirely different system that acts in an entirely different way with entirely very predictable outcomes about what that looks like and how that affects performance over time, how that develops talent, as an example. And so really what we're doing is just studying all of those components, seeing what the impact of that is. And then what you can start to do is, once you understand all of those sort of like limitations and the capacity of teams to be successful, you can start looking at other things like coaching, for example. If a team is very, very cohesive and a new coach comes on board who's not exactly, a genius, does the team keep winning? Or is an experienced coach more likely to be successful or unsuccessful when they come into a high cohesion team? Can a good coach take a low cohesion team and make them better? What does that look like? Why is it that some teams dramatically improve? What's going on? How much are they underperforming, performing? So then you start. It's like a Pythagorean, triangle, if that makes sense. Like you figure out. I'm the worst mathematician in the world. That's why other people do it. But if you can figure out 2 corners of the triangle, you can figure out the angle of the third. And so the more we look at it, the more you can say, okay, well, how do you make a competition better? How do you make a system better? How do you make a club better? What are the things you need to be cautious of? What are the things that can completely derail teams, right, in terms of their ability to be successful? And a lot of it is about avoiding derailing teams from a level of success. And one really simple example of that is don't have more than one person with a knowledge of a position selecting who that person's going to be. So if you look at, I've been pretty public in this, is that they came up with an idea in 2019 to have 4 selectors, a selection panel. Well, selection panels in and of themselves, even if incidentally, are going to try to justify their existence, right? But if you've got 3 people who have an understanding what the backline should be, all of them have great ideas, but you end up horse trading between them as to who that person's going to be. And so, there's a term, a phrase I use, which is you don't find combinations, you build combinations. But if you keep trying to find combinations, all you would do is end up in no man's land. And then what you end up having somebody debuting in a final, which we would always say, you don't want them debuting in a final, you want them debuting 2 years before the final to then build the understanding up to where you can be in a good position, because otherwise it's completely catastrophic. I hope that gives just a semblance of the kind of stuff we're looking at.
I think it breaks it down well. Further to that, you have the TWI, or Teamwork Index. How does that fit into the idea of cohesion?
So TWI was kind of like the first thing we were looking at, but we were only looking at franchises. So TWI doesn't really relate to systems like a country or an Olympic program or gymnastics program. TWI is fundamentally about the way a franchise is constructed. So are you a buy, are you a build? So if you look at the number 1 TWI team in the world is Leinster. Okay, number 2 used to be number 1 Crusaders. And then if you have a high TWI, what are the factors that come with it? Well, one is that you are much more likely to be fielding a cohesive team if you are a high TWI club. In other words, you are an internal development club as opposed to an external development club. Now, it's not saying that you can't have a high cohesion team with an external development club. If you look at, say, Toulon, 10 years ago, they took a bunch of amazing players with an enormous amount of money, but they had to reach a certain point of minimum levels of understanding in order to get that to win. But if you look at the history of Toulon from go to woe, they've dramatically underperformed to their budget because they've spent most of their time being uncohesive, because when you buy, you're much more schizophrenic because people come and go all the time. Whereas when you create a system over time, to say a Penrith Panthers have done or a Leinster have done, then there's a lot more continuity to the outcome, because there's a lot more continuity to the structures and to the TWI and to the game day, if we might call it cohesion, the team that you put on the field. But you can have a high TWI club, particularly in the AFL, which is the highest TWI league in the world, by quite some margin. You can have a high TWI team that isn't winning because they're rebuilding with kids, for example, very, very young. Yeah. So having said that, Penrith have had such an enormous advantage in TWI and structure that they've been winning the comp with the youngest or second youngest team in the comp. And so the correlation between experience and success in sport is, once you remove cohesion, it's pretty negligible. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So TWI is basically philosophy of your club, if that makes sense.
Before we go on, you've had your modelling peer reviewed by statisticians, and they have identified significant correlations between your modelling and team success. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, there is, and that I'm happy about. But the problem is that you have to move beyond that, because there's also a really strong correlation with putting the ball down over the white line and winning games.
Yeah.
Right? But that's really hard to achieve that. And so what you have to move beyond is you have to move beyond what is the causative comparatively to the correlative. And where we've really drawn a lot of interesting work is looking outside of the franchise modelling, because you're always subject to this notion of, well, if I have a good team, therefore I will keep that team together. Right? Now, the problem with that is, one, if you have a good team and you're not cohesive, you don't win. You have to get the team to a point of being together for a period of time before you do win. But then when you look at representational modelling, what that does is a lot of the time the decisions around cohesion or improving cohesion are not made to make things better. They're oftentimes an aversion to making things worse. So, for example, you might have political ramifications that affect geography. Now, geography is a huge driver in cohesion analytics, completely outside of control of the scenario. So if you look at, for example, when Yugoslavia broke up, the component countries that were of Yugoslavia outperformed Yugoslavia itself in its team sports, which was football and water polo, right? So even though now they were dealing with much smaller pools of talent, because they were much more cohesive, because now they were drawing from less clubs, for example, their outcomes actually went up and their ability to produce talent went up. So there's two significant components to the production of talent. One is the straight numbers of people playing the game. But if you went by that, English rugby, French rugby would never lose, right? Because they just outnumber everybody. But the stability of the teams inside of that engine is actually a much bigger driver of talent. So you end up with these scenarios. I remember Joe Roth saying to me, like, how is it that the best number 9 and number 10 in the world live 2 blocks from each other? Like, that doesn't make sense unless you kind of look at it through this guise, which is, it's actually the being together that makes them better. We looked at this a lot with bands, musical bands as an example. And, you know, most of the bands, I think 29 of the top 36 bands in the world, by sales of albums, are high school bands like U2 and Rolling Stones. But the chances of like Bono and Edge going to school together are 1 billion to 1, or, you know, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger went to kindergarten together. And yet they are significantly talented individuals now. But the chance of that talent actually being together in one place at the same time is pretty light on. So that's probably one of the biggest jumps that I've found in this research is understanding, okay, it's being together and the stability of the environment that allows them to get better. And the easiest way to describe that is in chaos, right? In chaos, and I'm not casting any aspersions, but I know you're at the 2 Blues, for example, right? Right. So that club naturally has, for a whole bunch of reasons, a high amount of turnover of its players. It's much harder to coach in that environment and make players better if they keep changing on you all the time. How can you be a better jumper if you're having a different hooker throw the line out every week? Because you're spending all of your time adjusting. Whereas if you're at Sydney Uni, their retention from Colts to grade is significant. Right, that's the trick that people miss for Sydney Uni. It's not their talent; it's their talent production that allows those players to improve. But it's not. You know, a lot of Sydney Uni coaches have left Sydney Uni and not had success elsewhere unless they're at high cohesion clubs. So it has a significant impact on the production of talent, and so that's a really big thing that we've been looking at, how to try to measure that, and how then try to. Can you change that in the environment? Can you change the rate at which a club produces talent? And what's the impact of that? Or could you do it in a country, for example?
Did that play an impact on the Brumbies' success when you're all together in a smaller town, spending more time with each other?
The biggest impact by a mile is you had 3 grades underneath them playing at the Kookaburras.
Yep.
Right. So so we did a history of Australian rugby, and you know, the Kookaburras were introduced in 1995. So you had first grade, reserve grade, and you had Colts. That basically then became the Brumbies with 6 or 7 Randwick players. Within 3 years, they were outstripping everyone else in the comp with cohesion. Now, we were also living in a bubble. And one thing we did find when COVID hit, for example, is the bubble teams started to outperform their numbers. So Warriors, for example, Melbourne Storm, really hard with Melbourne Storm because they're very, very cohesive anyway. The Victorian AFL teams is because they were getting more time together on the training paddock. They weren't just up and leaving, they were continuing the conversation. It wasn't about emotional familiarity, it was about game day familiarity. And that's a really big difference in our work is I'm not interested in whether they like each other. In fact, there's really not a lot of evidence that liking each other helps. But if you are on the same page, you will end up probably having a much more significant chance of getting on with somebody because they're doing their job. But if it's about understanding what are you, when you and I are playing in the centres together, God forbid that wouldn't be a great centres combination, would be a 12. But when their 10 passes behind the line to the fullback, do you hold or shoot? Now, I don't have time to look. So I know as soon as that pass is made, you're going to go, and I'm not going to go with you, or I'm going to go with you. And there's a great piece of footage, actually, when Jamie Roberts first came on for the Tars. The exact same thing happens. Roberts sprints out of the line. No one else in the line knew he was going to do it. And then they stepped right around him and went straight into that gap. Right? It happened a lot with the Newcastle Knights when Kurt Gidley was at fullback as the most experienced player in the team, but he was shooting on his own. And so what ends up happening is that when Roberts was, say, at the Lions or at, in Cardiff, I think it was his club, they would know he was going to go and they would go with him. Or Nonu when he went to the Highlanders or went to the Blues or went to Rico. So it's that level of understanding, but not of who you are as a person, what your middle name is, what your history is, personal history is. It's, okay, what does he do on this play? And we don't even have to get on. It's just understanding what the scenarios are in each of those circumstances. But the chance is, if you're not doing something outside of program and I'm not doing outside of program, we're probably going to feel better about each other as an impact of that.
Yeah. There is a big belief around the role team culture plays in success, but you don't necessarily buy into this idea. Can you explain why?
The problem is like, what's the evidence on it? Like, have you found any studies that show culture makes a difference? I can't find anything that says it. But what tends to happen is, when I was at the Brumbies and we were winning, everyone kept talking about what a great culture it was. And I'm like, no, this is a really badly behaved bunch of humans I'm part of here. But no one would believe me. Or if you look at Legacy as a book about the All Blacks, okay? It's a great book. It's really interesting. But I've never been in any teams that function in that way, and I'm not sure if the All Blacks do function that way, but I do know that Aaron Smith still got caught in the toilets with his mistress, and there's been reports on drug taking and abuse of women, and like that's come out publicly. They've done reports on it, but everyone ignores it with the All Blacks. No, the All Blacks are special. If the All Blacks are special, if their numbers were low, they would still win, which they don't. They're just exactly the same as every other team in the world. They've just had a really good system that's pretty aligned for a number of years, including, like I said, having the Crusaders and Wellington, which used to be very highly cohesive, that formed the basis of their team. So, and then you could go to sort of other examples of teams that have really bad cultures, like the Crazy Gang at Wimbledon was a massive bullying culture, or the West Coast Eagles, with Chris Judd and Mainwaring. They were in the final 16 of 18 years, but, one of them recently went to jail, and he said, I was told by the senior players, if you're not going to smoke crystal meth with the older players, you don't be part of this environment, right? Now, I don't know any performance specialist who would recommend a team smokes crystal meth together. But here's what I think is happening a lot of the time. If you have been together long enough, you start to form normative behaviours, such as doing drugs, going to strip joints, or having breakfast together. Now, let's remove that as a causative notion of outcome. That's actually an outcome of knowing one another and spending time together, okay? Or they did a study in the NBA and they found that teams who were winning were all hugging each other and high-fiving each other. But then when they tried to get teams to do it that weren't winning, it backfired terribly because they didn't know each other. What was actually happening was the teams that had been together a long time were hugging each other because they'd known each other a long time, but that wasn't what was making the team win. Does that make sense? So whenever we look at anything from a cultural perspective, you have to begin with what is the outcome of high cohesion teams. So one is clarity, high levels of clarity, high levels of purpose. You do things for your family you wouldn't do for other people. They treat each other like families, they act like families. But sometimes they can also hate each other. Sometimes they're also terribly behaved. But they do have a very high level of understanding. They defend well. It's another component of it. But in terms of that cultural component, what happens is they'll see them saying, look, they're all hugging each other on the field. That's what the Melbourne Storm culture is all about. And then the teams who aren't doing it. It's like, yeah, because they met 2 weeks ago. Why would they hug each other? You and I don't hug. We haven't met one another yet. If you saw me in the street, you wouldn't hug me, would you? But that doesn't mean we don't get on. It might come at some point, but it comes with time, right? It comes with time. So what I'm trying to understand is what is the causative nature of the culture part, and so what I'm then trying to get to is, okay, what is the evidence here? Where does the evidence point to? The other thing that comes about is psychological safety. I'm more psychologically safe with my family and than I am with you. But that doesn't mean you're not a good person. I just don't know you well enough yet. So there's also a very strong high correlation between psychological safety and success, but that doesn't mean it's why they win. If you look at, say, there's two guys at Manchester United, whose names I've completely forgotten for a second. It'll come back to me. Who didn't speak for 3 years because they had a falling out when they played for England. When one scored, the other would go the other end. God, the names will literally come to me at the end of this conversation. I apologise.
That's all right.
But that to me just pointed to like, oh wow. So there's actually there's some rowers in New Zealand don't get on at all, don't like each other. There's members of bands that don't like each other, don't get on. I played with guys in the Wallabies I don't like. I didn't get on with them, but I did my job, they did their job, and it was okay. So trying to make people like each other and trust each other is a pretty pointless exercise, to be honest with you. It's going to come organically.
So culture is essentially an outcome of good cohesion.
Yeah. And I'm going to hold that view until somebody else can show me something else. But, for example, when they've done studies on can you improve psychological safety without increased tenure, no one's been able to achieve it yet. The studies have shown that basically you can't change it. So if you can't change psychological safety without basically just putting time into the scenario, time into the relationships, then fundamentally you're going to have to look elsewhere to get performance improvements.
If cohesion is the answer, how do you create or manufacture it at a club, and what is an expected time frame from start to seeing results?
A minute. So there's a law of diminishing returns with cohesion, right? If you take two tennis players, throw them together, after one game you'll get significant improvement, and it'll improve at a non-linear rate. So there'll be a law of diminishing returns with the improvement. So the 300th game you and I play together in the centres, or Triple Cronkins, Cameron Smith, the 300th game doesn't make as much difference as the first, right? But there's a massive context to this. What competition am I in? If you enter the AFL, right, and you held your team together with no changes for 3 or 4 years, you probably still wouldn't have enough cohesion to beat anyone else yet. That's probably 2 years. I mean, I know, so with GWS, they won 3 games in their first 2 years with all the talent they were given. Because that competition is so cohesive, in order to catch up to everyone else, or to catch up to all the amount of games they have together and whatever it might be, is going to take years. Whereas if you do that in the A-League, if you just have a small differential in skill, you can do that pretty quickly. You can catch up to everyone really, really fast. So the timeline is within the context of the competition that I'm in, right? What is the competition I'm in? I remember we were talking to a team in the MLR when they were going to start. And one of the scenarios was, well, the best way to win that comp was take externally shared experience. So a good example, that was the Giltinis. They had a lot of externally shared experience, cohesion in the team they brought in. In that comp, because there's no cohesion, that was enough to win it. Mm-hmm. But one way you could do it is gut everyone else. Like if you want to win the Sydney comp, I would gut Uni. I would gut Uni and gut Manly, take the 2 highest cohesion teams in the league, form a new team with them, so that you've already taken out 2 of your competitors. But the problem with that is completely unsustainable, right? Mm-hmm. But how you're going to go and what level of performance you're going to get, because sport is up against something else all the time. So you always have to compare it to what you're up against. And, one of the things we found, for example, with the AFL was a club where we were talking to and said, well, you guys got 4 less losses this year, but your strength of opposition was like 40% higher. So you actually did better this year than you did last year, even though you won less games. And then there's a sort of macros of, well, your team's 3 years older now on average than it was, 3 years ago. But that means you're not reloading, which really means you're not making progress in terms of cohesion. You're just kind of going to get to a point and fall off an edge. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics within the scenario of what you have. And so there is no answer to how long, because you're up against other people. But we know from work we've done on teams individually who are working on, say, just individual outcomes, we know what that looks like. So if you take two people, for example, and get them to do a task like juggling, we know how long that would take to get to, say, 10 pins doing juggling, right? There'd be a set of data analytics around that. But the problem with sport is someone's trying to tackle a juggler, and the strength of that tackler changes all the time. So how you perform is different. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. If the calibre of players that make up the combinations are weak, then is cohesion still a factor? For example, I'll go back to the example you used of Toulon, who brought in a heap of superstars and still weren't world beaters straight away because they lacked cohesion. But how about if I coach a team, we've been on the bottom of the ladder for 3 or 4 years, but we've kept the same roster and we've stuck to the same structures? Are we looking at a chance through cohesion for that team to become a premiership winning team over time? How would that work?
It's the same answer as the question you asked before. What are we up against here? If I took an AFL team, right, if I took a low cohesion club now like St Kilda, and I said, right, I'm going to keep that list together, it's too old to catch up. It's too far gone. But one of the things we've looked at quite a bit is the significance on stability of the environment to allow the entry of new players into that environment. So we did a study on the EPL, and one of the things we looked at was what makes success out of the academies. And it wasn't the talent from which they were pulling, it was the stability of the team above them, right? It's like saying, if you are a child born into a stable family, you have much more likelihood of success than if you were born genetically blessed, right? If you were born into an unstable environment, then your likelihood of success drops dramatically. So by making a club stable, the first thing you'll do is you'll make it a better environment for the acquisition of skill of those coming through the system, but also how they perform once they come into that system. Right. So that's the difference between, unstable, non-aligned systems and, say, the Crusaders, is that when somebody generally plays for the Crusaders, they've generally played with about 11 of their teammates before they've played. Sterling Mortlock talked a lot about, because we work with Sterling, about playing for the Wallabies for the first time, and he looks inside and there's Bernie, and he looks outside and there's a whole bunch of Brumbies there. It's like, oh, easy. Like, I know exactly what to do off Greg's. If you look at the last pass in the World Cup final, when Owen Finnegan comes on, they hadn't actually played that many tests together, but that was the exact play, that S-ball, that they'd done at the Brumbies like 300 times. Mm. And you could just see it happening before it happens. And so that made it so much easier for Owen to be able to come on and be effective within the context of that environment. So what was I apologise, can you just rephrase the question? I just want to make sure I finish the question right. So
it was basically around the idea, can a low-performing team improve through cohesion alone?
Yeah, so the positive part is that what we've found, and we've done our own experiments on this, is that let's take a team who's terrible and performing terribly, okay, and force them to field the same players the next week. That sometimes happens, particularly with small countries, for example. They just don't have anyone else to pick. And then you take a team who's winning and they pick the same team again, right? The level of improvement in the team that lost is greater than the level of improvement in the team that won, because they are not subject to the law of diminishing returns to the same extent, because they're already probably highly cohesive. So we find that pretty much no matter what the circumstances are, but if we took very, very highly skillful players, and then we took players who are terrible, and we keep them together, no matter what their level of skill is, their level of output increase is exactly the same after doing something once and then second time. So we do this experiment with Lego, and round 1 to round 2, everyone improves 47%. People at the top, people at the bottom. Second round, 27%. Third round, 13%. So they'll keep on improving. And the people actually at the bottom actually improve more than the people at the top in terms of the actual amount of time, because that's how they form the percentage, if that makes sense. So it's that if you have a team and you're keeping it the same and the competition is maintaining a level of change so that you should have caught up to the rest of the competition, then something is probably fundamentally wrong. And that's really, I can't express how rare that is, right? If you don't make changes to a team and everyone else doesn't make changes to their team, then you're not going to catch up significantly, although you might improve as the season goes. But what it will, at least, even if you do stabilise, what it also allows, though, to do is it allows people to actually improve. It actually allows people to get better. If you look at France, generally, unless you go to Clermont or Toulouse, people don't really get better in France. There's too much chaos for them to improve in those environments. But yeah, the answer to that question would be, if you're not getting better, there's probably something awry. But even if you're not getting better, there is things you're doing to set yourself up for further success down the line.
How about cohesion between the board, the coaching staff and the playing group? Is that important as well? For example, we hear a lot of issues about the Manly Seagulls between the board and the coaching staff and the players. Did that play a role in on-field success or lack of it at the Seagulls?
What I'd say to you is that a high cohesion team can absorb the pain that comes from a non-cohesive board. In other words, Manly hasn't had a high cohesion board probably in a long time, but they have had a high cohesion team at certain points along the way. So if you have a high cohesion team and you have a low cohesion board, what generally does is that then manifests itself down, because they'll keep changing CEOs. And that's what's weird with Manly, is so many CEOs, but Desi's kind of been a bit of some form of stability there, at least, but for example, when they went to Barrett, cohesion dropped away dramatically. Des had to then bring it back up. It's nowhere near what it was 6 or 7 years ago. And so he's now deemed to be underperforming, therefore they've decided to move him on. But it's generally, if it starts with the board and you get misalignment at the board, or you get, I think Parramatta Eels was a very good example of this, of having a limit on tenure of 2 years, is everybody on that board wanted to have success inside of 2 years. And so you have to have, what are we doing? Grant talked a lot about being on the same page. If everyone is on the same page with each other and not having overlap of opinions. And one thing I ask board members is, why are you on the board? Would you be prepared for this club to be successful after you left? Are you here because you want to be involved in recruitment? Are you here because you want to be held responsible for the success of the team? Are you here because you love the club? Because a lot of that will change the decisions that are made. And, a lot of guys we talk to in coaching will say to us, I understand everything you're saying about cohesion, but I don't have permission to do any of this. I don't have permission to be stable. They've told me I have to get 10 wins next year. That's the problem. You could take Bellamy and put him at the let's say the Titans. And if the board did not have patience with him, then the outcome would be exactly the same. So if you have to have the three components, is the board, which oftentimes just by being not involved in the process, it can often be very helpful. It's the interference in a lot of times, people want to get involved. Then you've got the DOR, whatever position that might be, so sort of director of rugby type role. And then you've got the head coach. But I think one of the most dangerous things that we see quite repeatedly is, don't just hand everything over to the coach, because he'll come in, make changes based on his needs, which might be, I want to coach the national team in the next 3 years. I want to coach State of Origin. I want to retire. I want to have a legacy. I don't want the person after me to win, which is very plausible.
Yeah.
So if that person kind of hijacks, then that becomes their own sort of personal fiefdom. What you need to have is a line for the club. Like if you look at Sydney Uni is not one person, right? It's a way of thinking. This is the way we do business, and they've done business that way very successfully for a long period of time. And it's aside from the coaches. A lot of coaches have come through that system and then gone elsewhere. And like I said, not necessarily replicated that level of success because that system is so fundamentally well constructed.
Is there a need for boards to be educated so that they understand the cohesion process and are not developing unrealistic expectations on coaches, like demanding a certain number of wins or a premiership in a certain period of time?
If you're putting forward that scenario, like how many wins should we get this year, you're already in deep trouble. You're already, because you're not counting, for example, what are they going to put out on the field, right? If everyone gets better, you won't get better. If they all dramatically improve in their cohesion, you won't actually improve at all, but you actually might make significant progress. You know, we talk a lot about winning a title but destroying a club at the same time. You know, we've seen clubs who've said, bugger this, we're just going to spend $1 million on players. They do it. They underperform in the first 10 weeks. They back end because they build cohesion. Norths did this in 98, right? But the club did not become sustainably successful till like 07, 08. But it aligned with your time there, but we're not going to make any. You know. But it took time to kind of, like, there was a fallout from those decisions. So you can win it, but you know, if the lower grades get the shits and don't want to turn up anymore because the club's buying its success and there's no attention on the lower grades, then you're in deep trouble because you're progressing, you're reducing your development, for example. So it's really about saying, let's build a system for the club or the organisation or the country that builds sustainable success over a period of time. And what does that look like? How long is that going to take? And it might take a lot longer than you expect it to be. I mean, everyone joked about Phil Gould with his 5-year plan, but my God, that system's functioning now on all cylinders beautifully. And one of the mistakes that may have been made was in the late 90s, when the whole league was unstable due to the Super League war, you could build success faster, you know, but you can't do that anymore because the competition's gone up in its standards to create that level of success. So, so the answer to your question is, can you just repeat the question? I'm so sorry. I just want to make sure I get it right.
Should boards be educated around the role cohesion might play in success?
Yeah, I mean, I've done it. It doesn't always suit people's agenda. One of the things we find really interesting is if you've always been part of a high cohesion team yourself, then you're basically told hundreds of times, you are special, you are different. And if somebody comes along and says, well, actually, there's no evidence you're any different to anyone else, you're just part of a really good team, that challenges people's theories of themselves, right? And so they don't necessarily want to have that laid bare, you know. I've had conversations with coaches where there was 2 brothers and one of them had been at a really terrible low cohesion club and said, I know exactly what you're talking about. Another one had never played at one ever in his career. And he's like, why can't I make this team win? And it's like, because you are functioning on a team at 1/7 anything you ever played in. It's not going to, no matter how much you scream at people, it's not going to fix that problem. So you have to fix it with systems. So if it's the board, sometimes the best thing you can do is reduce the power of a board. You know, we talk a lot about singularity of vision, and the easiest way to get to singularity is less people with vision. You know, you don't want a 15 people board. You probably want 4 to 6 because you just have less overlap and less, you know, growth is the enemy of understanding. The more people you have, the harder it is to actually make appropriate decisions. And so just keep it really, really lean. Small board, singular person who's a DOR, and somebody who's going to be there for a long time, or at least, if not, then have a system that's going to remain no matter who comes in, who comes out. And you need to retain a lot of memory. I remember us talking to a club and they said to us, this is really good stuff. You should have been here a couple of years ago. And we said, we were, but none of you were in the room. So we'd been there, but none of them had been, because the whole thing had turned over. So therefore they completely lacked any institutional memory. And so you see teams making the same mistake again and again and again, just with a different person, which is bizarre. You'd think they'd remember, but they don't.
Earlier, you mentioned that teams within teams or units within teams develop cohesion quicker than the team on the whole. If this is the case, are there specific groups such as a 9-10 in rugby or a spine in rugby league or the midfield in a football or an AFL team that we should prioritise building long-term cohesion for?
100%. And the easiest way to describe it is you have to build things inside out. You build things from the middle out. So generally people who are on the end of the chain have to deal with less relationships, right? So an end of the last cog in the chain, I don't even know what it's called, the last part of a chain only has to deal with the relationship with the chain inside it. But the chains in the middle, parts in the middle have to deal with relationships on both sides. So in rugby, in football, midfielders, in rugby league, it's the spine and the centres. In rugby union, it's the decision-making, highly interactive. So 2, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, yada, yada, yada. So, but even like, for example, 13 and 14 is an important relationship. 13 and 11 is an important relationship. So you might have really good wingers who are highly effective, but they might struggle in their understanding with that centre in defence. So, if I look at Folau in his early time, he was absolutely amazing on his ability to score a try once he had the ball. But even because we were sort of part of that, just in the coach's box, they were saying he's missed his line on this play, he's missed his line on this play. Or George Smith had come in late and he was missing his position on seam defence. Now, with George Smith, you gain significantly in other areas. And if you look at his performances with Wasps, for example, he was just unbelievable in what he passed on to the players, the outcome that he got. But you get that with a 7 who flankers are really interesting because they don't really exist in the defensive line as much. They kind of like sit outside it, then enter it when they decide to. So they're actually acting more like a lone wolf a lot of the time. So that's a really good example of somebody that you can probably go for that skill in terms of your acquisition, but you need to understand, okay, on the seam defence, we're going to have 3 more line breaks against us, for example. Yeah. So you've just got to be able to understand that and deal with that.
Yeah, okay. Ben, you and Gainline Analytics played a large role in the recent Gold Digger documentary. Has this prompted any interest from Rugby Australia or any other nations that could be interested in what you're doing at the moment?
So there's limitations around what I can say on that front. So we just basically have a policy is we don't talk publicly of who we work for. There's a number of reasons behind that, but fundamentally, just because we're working for somebody doesn't mean they listen to us. Sometimes they do, and it works. Sometimes they don't, and we're just mapping the fallout of that, right? So that you can map somebody, you can map their cohesion, but they're one of the challenges of the levers they can pull. What are the levers they can pull? What are the levers they're prepared to pull, right? So if you look at the example of Australian Rugby, the reduction of teams is somebody who gets brought up a lot. But if it's like me saying to you, okay, you've got 7 kids, you've probably got 3 too many. You're going to have to get rid of 3 of them. Well, now they're born. I don't know if you're so keen for that, right? Yeah. It's a really hard decision. There's a lot of fallout from that decision to get rid of them. So we're just going to have to make it as efficient as we can, given the scenario. That'd probably be where I've softened over the years with Australian Rugby, is because of the fallout and the levers you can pull. And even the way the board is constructed with RA fundamentally works against that, since the Arbib report. It's just not built to act in the interest of Australian Rugby. It acts in the interest of the states, which is fine. It just has a different set of outcomes for it. So I would say that we have done work for RA. We would like to continue to do that work for RA, but we are currently working for other organisations in that space, either from a club basis or from an international basis. But I just can't talk about who that is. But every time you do a piece of press, we're just trying to make people aware of what we do. But what I would say is that unless they have an appetite to actually fix the problem, then please don't waste our time, because we have a lot of conversations with people and we say, okay, here is what we can do. Here's how you can fix it. Oh, we don't want to do that. Can't we just do some team building exercises? And I'm like, probably not. Yeah. So, because you actually want to fix the problem, or do we want to just dance around the edges of the problem?
In terms of coaches, both high performance and coaches in the development pathway, do you think there should be more education around the cohesion models and taking more of those principles on board. Naturally, there are going to be some people who, where their own experience might dictate an attitude of, I know what's best and I'll keep doing what worked in the past. But on the whole, is it worth promoting cohesion in coach education?
So I can only go by the experience we've had. And the guys who generally are the most comfortable to listen to this are the guys who've been around the longest and have the most experience. So Arsene Wenger, I've spent 7 hours with in total now, and said this is exactly what I've always felt, but no one's put into data, because he understands his limitations. Craig Bellamy, Wayne Bennett, Gerard Houllier, guys who've been around a significantly long time and experienced different types of teams. Bellamy's automatic response was, okay, now I understand why I have the worst record as a coach in the state of origin, because of what I was up against, what I couldn't change, So, but there are other coaches who don't want to have the conversation for a number of reasons. One is the system of how coaches are recruited, I think, is flawed to a certain extent, because if a lot of the times the coaches don't necessarily understand the environment they're going into, and so make promises they can't keep. When I went into Norths, I said I can turn it around. I couldn't turn it around. In fact, it got worse, because we had massive turnover in first grade, massive fallout from previous decisions, and we didn't win a game, right? Now, at the time, I just thought, I'm just obviously a terrible coach. And then later on, when I went to Japan, I'm like, oh, no, I'm a good coach. Maybe I've gotten better, maybe I've gotten worse. But then the more I went around, the more I kind of understood that my aspect wasn't necessarily changing a whole bunch. I was trying to grow, but the ability for that to make a difference fundamentally on the outcome is that the other decisions I made, who I put in the team, who I recruited to the club, was having a much bigger impact on the outcome than the actual the tactical component or the cultural component, whatever you might want to call it. So there's also a term we call the gain line curse, which is our work will suit coaches at different points. If they feel like they're going to be fired, they'll come to us and say, please explain to my board that I shouldn't have made these promises. And generally, I think 8 out of the 9 times that happened, the coach has been fired. It's like you're trying to reverse engineer permission to fail. It's too late for that. You need to have the conversation about that earlier. Like, this year is going to be a really rough year because you've told me to win and bring in a lot of senior players. So we're going to have some level of underperformance for probably the first year until the back end. So we might lose 8 of the first 10 and then win 6 of the next 10. Maybe miss the finals, maybe we don't. But next year, if we keep that group together, we'll be in a sound position to do well. Now, if you can say that before the season starts and show them why that's going to take place, then they might be prepared for that. But if you don't, and they say, hang on, we spent $7 million on this team this year and brought in all this talent, you've gotten worse. You've got to go. There's something wrong here. You're significantly underperforming. Whereas they're actually not underperforming at all. They're just performing how they should do.
So one of the things you've just identified is the Australian Rugby model. We're going to stick with 5 Super Rugby teams, despite some data suggesting we could be more successful as a nation with 3 teams, and we limit our selections to those 3 teams. But we're sticking to 5 teams because it gives rugby more of a national footprint, and there are also other benefits to having 5 teams. But now we've also opened up to selecting players who are playing in other leagues around the world, such as Japan, the UK and France. Is that now having more of a detrimental effect on team cohesion than picking from the 5 teams alone?
Yeah. It makes it worse, but it makes the long-term future worse. So if you have a notion of 5, you want to be in a position to, the question that should be asked is, 1, is our system of alignment appropriate? In other words, club into Super Rugby into the Wallabies. Secondly is 3 or 4, let's put it this way, if you have 10 teams, the biggest impact on your performance is going to be how many of those teams are actually contractually stable. So Saracens, Exeter in the UK are a huge driver of the talent that flows into England. If they don't have that, then they're just chaos, right? Toulouse right now is the core of the French team. So inside of a system, the question is, how many teams can we afford to actually keep contractually stable? If the answer is none, then you should probably look at another system whereby you can build at least 1 or 2 teams that are contractually stable. So with Australian Rugby, we've gone from having 3 of the top 5 most stable teams in the world to 1 in the top 10 now. So that's going to affect our talent acquisition in the players within those environments, which means we don't produce talent at the rate that we used to, which means we don't get as many young Wallabies coming through the system in the same way that are ultra talented, because you've got George Smith playing in the Brumbies for a year, with probably one of the best teams in the world, that allows him to just go about doing what he does, not trying to have to fix everything in order to make them play well, for him to play well. So the answer is really multidimensional about what you'd be able to do to fix that problem. But if we say, right, let's look overseas, what you can often do, for example, if you look at 2015, what we did, we brought a lot of cohesion back from overseas, which helped in 15, but in 16, 17 was so bad that the team really started to struggle, because whoever then came in to play with Gitto there's no chance he's ever played with him. So therefore his ability to be absorbed into the team is dramatically poor. And then the other thing that happens is if we say, okay, we're going to pick overseas-based players, then more of the players will go, well, why am I staying here then? If I'm staying, I'm just going to go and bugger this, I'll go play for Scotland. Which is exactly what's happening right now.
Yeah.
So then we lose more talent overseas, so then we end up with a bigger problem. So it can actually, picking overseas-based players can actually manifest itself in short-term cohesion really well, but there is a significant long-term negative impact on your ability to create talent, but also your ability to create cohesion further down the line. It's like you're kicking the can further down the street.
I've heard people oppose that argument and use the soccer or football model, where most international teams have players playing in different leagues all over the world, and they all come back together to play as a team in international competitions.
That's great, but international football is entirely different. Cohesion's built faster in an 11-man game than it is in a 15-man game. So it's 2.5 times faster to build understanding in a football team than is a rugby team. Secondly, if you look at the history of the World Cups, generally the highest cohesion teams have won the World Cup. If you look at Spain, if you look at Germany with most of Bayern Munich playing for them, but it still doesn't solve the problem of how you create talent. If we go by that model, right, we basically stop the factory. And if you stop the factory, you're going to have to rely on overseas clubs to produce your talent for you. So you start praying that someone in Leinster has an Australian passport. And so what you're then doing is you're basically turning us into where Georgia are or where Fiji are, and they are praying for domestic representation. Like that's all they ever want. It's all Fiji wanted, is to have a club playing regularly because they know how much of a significant impact. Georgia are pleading for a club side. If you look at the impact of, a reduction in club teams in Wales on their performance, or you look at the Irish going from club to provinces, the impact of Leinster, it's been significant in their improvement over the past 20 years. So why move away from that? Because no matter what you do, even if it works in the short term, you turn off the tap. And once the tap's turned off, it takes a long time to put back together again. So cohesion's like a house. If you knock it over, 6 months to put it back together again. But multiply that out into, if TWI goes up 5% a year, that's a general rule of thumb we have. If you drop by 30%, that's 6 years to get it back. So if we destroy it now, it's a long way back to try to build it up again.
How about the junior pathway? Is that important long-term for building cohesion, whether it be in rugby or any other sport?
What does the Penrith Panthers tell you?
Yeah, I guess using that example tells us that it is important.
Yeah, it's significant, particularly in one of the things I see, for example, and I talk to a lot of people in gymnastics, strangely enough. A mate of mine's an English medalist in Commonwealth Games in gymnastics, obviously, which is it's pretty strong standard. But we talked a lot about a lot of the problem you have with juniors in gymnastics is that internationally, let's say Bulgaria is winning all the Olympic medals. So then the AIS or your national program will say, right, we're going to get Bulgarian coaches in. They're going to introduce that system. So they come in and this 8-year-old for the next 4 years does everything the Bulgarian way. So underhand on the bars or whatever it might be, or different core stability program. And then after 4 years, they're like, okay, the Bulgarians didn't work. And then Biles wins a gold medal. So they're like, okay, now we switch to the American system. So now she's 12 and she does the next 4 years in the US way, right? And then that doesn't work because the Chinese have just won 7 gold medals. So now we do it the Chinese way. So the problem is you got that poor girl's gone in, learn, unlearn, learn, unlearn, learn. And if we just stuck to the Bulgarian way the whole 12 years, she would have had a much better outcome. So if you have continuity of program and how you're playing, what it means is you don't have to have that unlearning process when you move up the grades. So you go from, Luai and Cleary playing the same way together, same plays. There's great footage of the big three at Melbourne Storm running the same play for Brisbane North and then doing it for Melbourne Storm and then doing it. It's like a 9-6, 9-7-1. And they just do it so beautifully, but it's like the 700th time they've done it. They do it in State of Origin, works again, everyone gets tricked by it. But the level of simplicity but complexity inside that simplicity of that play is so strong. They can adapt to any reaction anybody has against it because they've done it so many times in so many different ways that only comes with, sharpening the sword over hundreds and hundreds of times and looking at options. And so everyone says, okay, we need to do that play. If you then got West to that play, they would cock it up, right? Not because they're bad players, but you can't, the ways a team does something is not what you want to be copying. This is the problem a lot of the time when coaches go and do study tours, is they go and they do a study of the successful clubs. And one thing I always say is make sure you go to the clubs that are coming last because they're probably trying to do the same stuff. They've probably got the same ice baths and same cryo chambers and same psychologists or whatever. But the way in which somebody's doing something is not the clue. It's the way in which they're built, which is the clue, right? And that will be different for every club. So if you look at NRL, Penrith, Storm, Roosters are the three highest cohesion clubs basically last 10 years. All been successful, all done in completely different ways. Roosters have done it more through a trading cycle, but bringing guys young. Storm have done it through reasonably aligned systems, higher levels of internal contractual stability. Penrith have done it through an academy process, all appropriate to the way they were doing it. But if you said to Storm, do it the way Penrith do it, that wouldn't work. Mm. So it's whenever you go and look at how other people are doing things, don't look at how they're doing it. Look at they have probably created a system that is appropriate to them. And one thing I found really interesting is a lot of the time, teams' strengths are actually an outcome of adaptation to a weakness. So if you look at Australian Rugby, we don't have a lot of players. Therefore, we probably don't have a lot of big forwards. Therefore, we probably had to play more in the back line. Therefore, we became really good at it. Then that becomes our strength. But that was originally an adaptation to a weakness. And I hear that a lot from clubs. It's like, the way we play it didn't start out. It was just something we couldn't do something else, so we started to do something else.
It's really just Darwin's theory of evolution, isn't it? Pardon the pun.
Oh, yeah. Let's not bring me into that story. But yeah, 100%. Evolution, adaptation.
Ben, knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently if you were to go back into coaching?
Oh, you can't. I wouldn't have. If I had done it differently, I wouldn't have learned any of the lessons that I've figured out through doing it badly and making horrendous mistakes over the experience. But if you gave me a second shot at it, and you have the same set of knowledge, I would 100% do everything differently. But one of the challenges would be is that I probably wouldn't get any jobs because I wouldn't make promises I know I couldn't keep. But if I was to, let's say I wanted to coach Australia, I would go to the best run program in Australia as a club and take the lowest position at that club and just allow myself to kind of rise up through that scenario. And it was interesting because I went to the Brumbies because the Waratahs didn't want me and me or Bill Young. And yet that was a much better decision. It's not a decision we made. It was just kind of forced on us because they didn't want us, right? Mm. So, but if you go to the highest cohesion club, and that's as a player as well, you work your way up through that system, and then you stay until you can find another rung up the ladder that's just as well constructed. So if I'm in Australia right now and I'm looking at the 5 teams as a coach, I'm like, I can't turn any of this around in the short term, maybe over the long term. So I'm going to go coach at Leinster, right? And then you go to coach at Leinster, and then you say, okay, well, if I'm coaching at Leinster, so you look at Stewart at Leinster, who's now won all these European titles, and he's a great coach again. He wasn't a bad coach in the first place, right? So Lancaster, sorry. But then if you're then going to go and coach the Wallabies, that's a really challenging turnaround. So what you'd be hoping for is some kind of event/crisis that allows you complete control. Sort of in the scenario that how Checker took over. But once he lost that control, he lost the ability to get them to win anymore. So he held that for up to 15 because they were rushed in the scenario to take him in. It's like, okay, you have complete control here. Now we're going to wrest some of that control back from you. We're going to change how you select, change how you run the team, less Waratahs bias, more about the talent. Disaster. Not disaster, but a significant challenge in terms of replicating that continuous performance. So, yeah, if I was to go through that experience again, you just be very cautious of the rungs you grab onto on the way through there, because none of us are that good. We can tend to overcome this stuff. Well, I've never found anybody that can overcome it in professional sport yet.
Ben, thanks so much for coming on and giving up your time to chat. I think we've really unpacked some of the finer details around cohesion and provided coaches with some really good understanding of how it can be implemented in the junior pathways all the way through to the elite sporting environment. So all the best to you and the team at Gainline Analytics for whatever the future holds.
Thank you very much.
There is a lot to take in from this conversation with Ben. I know that Gainline Analytics ideas are gaining a lot of traction within parts of the sporting community here in Australia, and especially within the rugby community after the release of the documentary Gold Digger, The Search for Australian Rugby, which is a must-watch. Ben really goes into the detail of cohesion, and probably one of the biggest takeaways for me was that strong team cultures, however we want to define that, is potentially just an outcome of team cohesion. Another factor to consider is that we can build cohesion in any team we coach. It's not just something that is a focus for elite teams, but it does need to start from the inside and build outward. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it with your friends and colleagues. And until next time, keep learning.